While home prices in America's major cities have nearly doubled in the last decade, there are places in this country where you can still buy acres of land for less than the price of a used car. Not barren wasteland, not flood zones, actual productive land with water, soil, and sun just sitting there, affordable and almost completely ignored by the mainstream conversation about housing. Here's the contradiction nobody is talking about. The same economic pressure pushing millions of Americans out of cities is quietly making rural land ownership the most rational financial decision of this generation. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand why these shifts are happening before they show up in headlines, subscribe. Because what looks like a few cheap land listings is actually a much bigger economic story, and that's exactly what we're breaking down today. This isn't really about cheap land. It's about what's driving people toward it. Inflation didn't just raise prices. It exposed how fragile it is to rent your food, rent your shelter, and rent your energy from systems you don't control. At the same time, remote work quietly snapped the link between income and location for millions of Americans. These two forces colliding are sending a new wave of people, not just survivalists, not just retirees, toward land ownership as a serious economic strategy. These aren't random decisions. They're responses to a system under pressure. Today we're breaking down 10 of the cheapest and most overlooked states for homesteading in America. From land prices to local laws to what each state is quietly offering that most people walk right past. Stick to the end because the top 3 go much deeper, and the number 1 pick will genuinely surprise you. By the time this video ends, you'll see a pattern that changes how you look at the American land map entirely. According to USDA data, the average American farmland price has risen sharply over the past decade, but that average hides a massive gap between states. While California and Colorado farmland can cost tens of thousands per acre, entire counties in the South and Midwest still list productive land under $2,000 per acre, sometimes far below that. Meanwhile, 2024 surveys show homesteading interest has tripled since 2019, driven by food cost anxiety, housing unaffordability, and a growing distrust of supply chain stability. The people moving toward land right now aren't dropping out of society. They're making a calculated economic bet. These 10 states are where that bet makes the most financial sense. 10. West Virginia. West Virginia has some of the lowest land prices of any state east of the Mississippi, and almost nobody in the homesteading conversation talks about it. The state's population has been declining for decades, which sounds like bad news until you realize what population decline does to land prices. It drives them down. Rural counties in West Virginia regularly list 5 to 20 acre parcels between $800 and $2,500 per acre, with natural water sources, hardwood forest, and elevation that keeps summers cooler than neighboring states. The economic backstory here matters. The collapse of the coal industry left entire regions with shrinking tax bases and local governments quietly desperate for new residents. Broadband infrastructure investment is now reaching areas that were disconnected for years, making remote work viable in places that cost a fraction of any metro. The soil in the river valleys is genuinely productive. Corn, potatoes, livestock grazing, not the rocky hillside stereotype people assume. The one thing buyers overlook until they're standing on the property: the terrain. West Virginia is not flat. If you're building, grading land costs money, and that needs to factor into your budget before you fall in love with a listing. Could you build a life here? 9. Oklahoma is one of the most underrated agricultural states in the country, and the land prices still haven't caught up with what the soil is actually worth. Rural counties in the eastern and central parts of the state regularly offer land between $1,500 and $3,500 per acre, with some of the most fertile ground in the southern plains. Property taxes are low, consistently ranking in the bottom 10 nationally, and rural zoning restrictions are minimal compared to coastal or Midwestern states. The economic angle here is straightforward. Oklahoma's economy weathered multiple boom-bust cycles from oil, and that volatility kept population growth modest, which kept land prices restrained. What most people don't factor in is the tornado risk. Oklahoma sits directly in Tornado Alley, and building a homestead here means investing in storm infrastructure, storm cellars, reinforced structures that adds real cost. But for buyers who price that in up front, The per-acre value is difficult to match in any comparable growing. Climate. The state also has no restrictions on keeping livestock on rural parcels, which matters enormously for anyone serious about food self-sufficiency. Could you build a life here? 8. Arkansas. If you drew a circle around the Ozark Highlands and asked what land inside that circle costs, most people would guess wrong by a factor of 3. Productive woodland and pasture in rural Arkansas counties regularly sells for $1,200 to $2,800 per acre, and the state has one of the most favorable legal environments for off-grid living in the entire country. Rainwater collection is legal. Composting toilets are permitted in rural areas. Livestock on rural parcels faces almost no state-level interference. The economic story behind Arkansas's affordability is a familiar one. Decades of outmigration from rural areas as young people move toward Little Rock or out of state entirely. That demographic hollowing out suppressed land demand and kept prices stable, while surrounding regions climbed. What's shifting now is that a measurable counter-migration is beginning, driven by remote workers and homesteaders who've discovered the Ozarks offer 4 seasons, clean water, and genuine agricultural potential at prices that stopped making sense years ago. The growing season runs roughly 200 days. The Ozark Aquifer sits underneath much of the region. Those 2 facts alone explain why serious homesteaders who've done the research keep landing here. Do you build a life here? 7. Missouri holds a quiet legal advantage that most people researching homesteading never think to check until they're already committed to another state. It is one of the few states that places almost no restrictions on rainwater harvesting at the residential or rural level. For a homestead built around water independence, that single legal detail changes the math significantly. Land in the Missouri Ozarks, particularly in counties south of Interstate 44, ranges from $1,500 to $3,200 per acre depending on timber, road access, and water features. The state has a long agricultural history, and that history shows up in the infrastructure. Rural roads, grain co-ops, farm supply networks that don't require a 3-hour drive to access. The climate offers 4 full growing seasons with enough rainfall, typically 40 to 45 inches annually, to support diverse crops without irrigation dependence. What separates Missouri from its neighbors is the combination of legal flexibility, agricultural infrastructure, and genuine community density in rural areas. You're not pioneering into isolation. You're joining existing rural economies that know how to function. That matters more than most first-time homesteaders realize until year 2. Could you build a life here? 6. Tennessee gets brought up in homesteading conversations, but almost always for the wrong counties, the ones near Nashville's sprawl or the tourist corridor around the Smokies, where prices have inflated dramatically. The actual opportunity in Tennessee sits in the eastern rural counties and the Plateau region, where land prices still reflect the agricultural economy rather than the real estate speculation happening closer to the cities. In those counties, productive land with creek access sells in the $2,000 to $4,000 per acre range, and Tennessee's complete absence of a state income tax means every dollar of remote income goes further than it would in most comparable states. The growing season in Tennessee reaches 180 to 220 days depending on elevation, long enough for multiple crop rotations and serious livestock operations. The state's right-to-farm laws are strong, providing legal protection against nuisance complaints that can cripple homestead operations in more urbanizing states. The pattern in Tennessee is a race between rural affordability and urban sprawl, and in the specific counties worth targeting, rural still wins days. But the window is narrowing, faster here than anywhere else on this list. Could you build a life here? 5. Kansas is not a dramatic landscape. That is precisely the point. The flat, open terrain that makes Kansas look boring on a map makes it one of the most practical and cost-effective states for large-scale homesteading in the country. Per-acre prices in western and central Kansas regularly fall below $1,500, sometimes significantly below, for ground that has been farmed productively for over a century. The soil in Kansas is not marginal. This is the heart of the American breadbasket, and the same land that built family grain operations across the 20th century is now accessible to individual buyers at prices that don't reflect its productive capacity. The economic reason for that disconnect is depopulation. Kansas has been losing rural residents steadily since the 1980s as agriculture industrialized and small towns hollowed out. The tax base shrank, schools consolidated, and land that once supported 10 families now supports one industrial operation, and sometimes none. For a homesteader willing to live without urban amenities, that demographic retreat translates directly into buying power. Wind energy infrastructure spreading across the state has brought new grid reliability to areas that were energy isolated a decade ago. The one limitation Kansas presents honestly: water. The Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies much of western Kansas, is being drawn down faster than it recharges. Buyers need to investigate well depth and water rights before committing. Could you build a life here? 4. Alabama is the state that serious homesteaders discover last and regret not finding sooner. The combination of a year-round growing season, 200 to 240 days depending on county, low property taxes, and land prices ranging from $1,500 to $3,500 per acre in rural areas creates a value profile that is genuinely difficult to beat in the eastern United States. The state's timber economy means much of the rural land carries active timber value, which functions as a financial asset that works alongside a homestead rather than competing with it. Selective timber harvesting can generate income while simultaneously opening land for pasture. Property tax rates in rural Alabama counties are among the lowest in the nation. In some counties, a 20-acre parcel carries an annual tax bill under $300. The economic backdrop that kept Alabama land affordable is familiar: a state that industrialized later, urbanized more slowly, and retained a larger proportion of agricultural land than neighboring states that converted rural land to suburban development earlier. What's changing now is visibility. Alabama keeps appearing in cost of living comparisons, and that visibility is beginning to attract the kind of migration that drives prices. The window here is open, but it won't stay open indefinitely. Could you build a life here? If you've made it this far, you're already thinking differently about land than most people do. The last 3 states are where the real pattern locks into place, and honestly, number 1 caught us off guard when we dug into the data. If this breakdown is saving you research time, hit the like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need this information. Subscribe if you want this kind of economic analysis every week. Now let's finish this. 3. Michigan, Upper Peninsula. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is one of the most quietly remarkable land opportunities in North America, and its affordability traces directly to a century of economic boom and collapse that most Americans have forgotten. The UP, as locals call it, built its early economy on copper mining and logging, 2 industries that peaked before 1920 and left behind a landscape of small towns, forest land, and infrastructure built for a much larger population than currently lives there. Today, the UP covers nearly 30,000 square miles and holds fewer than 300,000 residents. That ratio, vast land, thin population, keeps property prices at levels that seem impossible until you start checking listings. Wooded parcels with stream access and road frontage regularly sell for $800 to $2,000 per acre. The economic significance that elevates the UP above other affordable options is a single asset that the global economy is beginning to price very differently: fresh water. The Upper Peninsula sits at the edge of Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron, 3 of the 5 Great Lakes, which together hold roughly 21% of the world's surface fresh water. As water scarcity becomes an increasingly serious economic and geopolitical issue, proximity to that resource represents a long-term value proposition that no other affordable land region in America can match. Local policy has responded to decades of population loss by making resettlement straightforward. Permitting is less restrictive than in more populated states, and rural land use laws favor individual property rights. The climate is demanding. Winters are serious, and the growing season compresses to roughly 120 to 150 days. But cold climate farming, root cellars, and greenhouse growing have long traditions in the region. Remote workers are beginning to discover the UP in measurable numbers, drawn by the combination of affordability, internet infrastructure improvements, and a landscape that offers something increasingly rare: genuine quiet. Could you build a life here? 2. Maine carries a coastal reputation that distorts how most people think about its land prices. The moment you move inland from the tourist corridor, past Portland, past the lake districts that attract summer money, you enter a different Maine entirely. Inland and northern Maine contains some of the largest areas of undeveloped privately held land east of the Mississippi River, much of it former timber company holdings that have been broken up and sold in recent decades. Rural inland parcels sell in the $500 to $2,000 per acre range, with significant acreage available in blocks that would be impossible to find at comparable prices anywhere in the northeastern United States. The policy story behind Maine's rural affordability is deliberate. The state has watched its rural population decline for decades and has actively pursued resettlement strategies, including rural broadband investment, property tax relief programs for working farms, and one of the strongest right-to-farm legal frameworks in the country. Maine's right-to-farm laws protect agricultural operations from nuisance lawsuits with unusual specificity, which matters for homesteaders who intend to keep animals, process food, or operate equipment on their property. The agricultural profile is real. Maine produces maple syrup, potatoes, blueberries, dairy and timber at commercial scale, and the same climate and soil that support commercial. Operations support homestead-scale production. The four-season challenge is genuine. Maine winters are cold and long, but that same climate produces a productive agricultural rhythm that experienced homesteaders consistently value. The broader economic significance of Maine's position is this: it is a state with the infrastructure, legal framework, and geographic assets to support serious rural resettlement, and its government has signaled clearly that it wants that resettlement to happen. For a homesteader weighing long-term land security and policy stability, that institutional support is not a small thing. Could you build a life here? 1. New Mexico. New Mexico is the #1 overlooked homesteading state in America, and the gap between what it offers and how rarely it appears in this conversation is genuinely striking. In specific counties in the southern and central parts of the state, raw land sells for $200 to $700 per acre. That is not a typo. Productive, high-desert land with documented solar exposure, road access, and legal water rights sells for prices that would not buy a single month of rent in most American cities. The economic history behind that affordability is layered. New Mexico is one of the poorest states by median income. It experienced significant rural depopulation across the 20th century, and its land economy never developed the speculative pressure that inflated prices in neighboring Arizona or Colorado. That economic marginalization created a buyer's landscape that has not yet been discovered by the mainstream homesteading market. The solar profile is extraordinary. New Mexico averages more than 300 days of sunshine annually, making it one of the highest potential states in the country for off-grid solar energy systems. A well-designed solar setup in New Mexico can achieve genuine energy independence at a cost that pays back faster than almost anywhere else in the continental United States. The water situation requires honest attention. New Mexico is an arid state, and water rights, governed by the state's acequia system, one of the oldest water governance frameworks in North America, are a serious legal matter that every buyer must research before purchasing. But legal water rights in New Mexico are real property rights with centuries of legal precedent behind them, and parcels with documented rights trade at a premium that reflects genuine scarcity value. Building codes in rural New Mexico counties are among the least restrictive in the country, enabling owner-built structures, alternative building materials, and off-grid infrastructure without the permitting friction that slows projects in more regulated states. The long-term economic significance of New Mexico's position sits at the intersection of two trends accelerating simultaneously: energy independence and food sovereignty. A homestead built on cheap New Mexico land with solar energy and legal water rights is positioned at exactly the convergence point those two trends are moving toward. That is not a coincidence. That is why this state sits at #1. Could you build a life here? Every state on this list is affordable for the same underlying reason. People left, economies contracted, and land prices followed. But people moving toward these states right now aren't making an act of desperation. They're making an act of economic foresight. The forces driving homesteading growth, food costs, housing unaffordability, energy fragility are not temporary, they're structural. And the Americans who recognize that early and act on it while land is still cheap are making a decision that compounds in value over decades. The window is open. In most of these states, it won't stay open much longer. If this gave you a clearer picture of where real opportunity still exists in America, subscribe to World Economics Explained. Every week, we go past the headlines and into the economic patterns most people won't notice until they're already living inside them. The next video continues this series, and the numbers get even more interesting.